Scarlet Street wasn't just Fritz Lang's most uncompromising American film, it was a $1.2 million act of calculated provocation that passed the production code only to be banned by 3 American cities in rapid succession, and the story of how a German refugee from the Nazi propaganda machine used a French novel about a pimp and a prostitute to make Hollywood's darkest argument about desire, art, and the impossibility of escape is one the critical establishment has spent 80 years describing without quite seeing. We are digging into the wreckage of Scarlet Street with 13 secrets the censor boards tried to bury, secrets locked inside production code administration correspondence, city censor filings, Patrick McGilligan's out-of-print biography of Lang, and the ruins of a marriage that ended on a Paris-bound night train. There is no Scarlet Street in the film. The name refers to no location in the narrative, appears on no signpost, and is spoken by no character across the film's 102 minutes. It is, instead, a piece of Victorian moral vocabulary, scarlet being the antiquated designation for a sexually promiscuous woman. The same scarlet that marks Hester Prynne's chest in Hawthorne's novel, the same crimson thread running through 2 millennia of misogynist literary tradition. The original French source material was Georges de la Fouchardiere's novel La Chienne, literally the bitch. That title announced exactly what kind of woman Kitty March is and exactly what attitude the narrative takes toward her. The Production Code Administration would never have permitted that title in any American theatrical market. What Diana Productions and Universal settled on instead was a circumlocution, a title that implies prostitution without stating it, that gestures toward the red light district while maintaining the deniability of metaphor. The censors approved it. Most audiences never parsed it. Fritz Lang, who had spent a decade watching Nazi propaganda, learned to say everything while appearing to say nothing, understood exactly what he was doing. But the real problem was that the title was the smallest piece of camouflage Lang had embedded in the finished film. By 1944, Fritz Lang had been in Hollywood for a decade, long enough to understand that the American studio system and the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda were not the same institution, but also long enough to understand that they were not entirely different ones. Both controlled what could be said. Both determined which stories were permitted to reach audiences. Both applied pressure at the script stage before cameras rolled, ensuring that the finished product confirmed rather than challenged the moral assumptions of its audience. Lang had fled Goebbels' offer of the directorship of German cinema in 1933, boarding a night train to Paris rather than accept the position of chief propagandist for a regime he found morally intolerable. What he discovered in Hollywood was a system that used different instruments, the production code rather than the Reichsfilm Chamber, the Breen office rather than the Ministry of Enlightenment to achieve comparable results. The suppression of narratives that failed to confirm that crime was punished, virtue was rewarded, and the social order was fundamentally just. Scarlet Street was Lang's most direct engagement with that suppression. He would make a film in which the guilty man went unpunished and the innocent man died for the crime, and he would get it past the censors by convincing them it was about something else entirely. This is exactly why Scarlet Street is not simply a film noir. It is a heist. The target was the production code itself. The literary and cinematic lineage of Scarlet Street leads directly and uncomfortably back to Jean Renoir's 1931 French film La Chienne, a film that was itself banned in the United States of America until 1975. Renoir's La Chienne is explicit about what Kitty is and what her boyfriend Dédé does for a living. She is a prostitute, he is her pimp. The moral universe of Renoir's film is sardonic rather than tragic. Renoir was a Frenchman, and the absurdity of a middle-aged cashier destroying his life for a professional who never pretended to love him registered for him as dark comedy rather than damnation. Lang was not Renoir. When Paramount had purchased the rights to the original novel, hoping Ernst Lubitsch would bring his famous touch to the material, the production code's enforcement machinery stopped it entirely. There was no version of the story Lubitsch could tell that the Breen office would approve. Lang succeeded where Lubitsch failed, not because he softened the material, but because he used its constraints the way a German expressionist used shadow, to make absence say what presence was forbidden to. But the real problem was not what Lang took from Renoir. It was what he gave back, and what Renoir thought of the exchange. Renoir was said to have disliked Scarlet Street. The formulation is diplomatic. What the production record suggests is that Renoir's objection was not to Lang's technical competence, but to his moral severity. Renoir's Legrand, the cashier who murders Lulu and lets her pimp hang for it, ends the film in a kind of cosmic equilibrium. a bum on the street who encounters his own painting being loaded into a wealthy man's car and laughs, recognizing the absurdity of a world in which his one authentic creation now decorates a bourgeois salon while he can barely buy a meal. It is a tragic comedy. Lang's Cross ends the same story in a condition of permanent psychological damnation, haunted by voices, wandering empty streets, denied both punishment and relief. The distinction matters because it is the distinction between a French view of moral chaos and a German view. Where Renoir saw the universe as indifferent and therefore darkly funny, Lang saw it as structured, purposeful, and specifically designed to produce the maximum suffering for the maximum number of people who deserve it least. The expressionist architecture of Scarlet Street is not stylistic decoration. It is Lang's argument about the nature of existence made visible. This is exactly why the Production Code Administration passed the film, and why 3 city censor boards immediately banned it. Scarlet Street was the inaugural production of Diana Productions, an independent company established specifically to give Fritz Lang the creative autonomy that working within the studio system denied him. Diana Productions was co-founded by Lang, producer Walter Wanger, and actress Joan Bennett, who was Wanger's wife. The structural logic was transparent. By producing outside the major studios, Lang could retain final cut authority over a project that no studio would have allowed him to make on their terms. The Production Code Administration still applied, Diana distributed through Universal, but the layer of studio development interference, the script committees and story department coverage and executive notes was removed. What Lang could control, he controlled absolutely. TCM's production records document that he was granted autonomy over the entire production, which the source notes describe as a dangerous and uneconomical proposition. Lang did not find it either. He found it the minimum acceptable condition for making the film he wanted to make. But the real problem was that creative autonomy over a film does not protect that film once it reaches a city censor board. And city censor boards were about to demonstrate exactly what they could do when no studio was there to absorb the blow. The decision to adapt La Chienne for Scarlet Street was not a spontaneous creative choice. It was a calculated exploitation of a legal and commercial opportunity that had been lying dormant for more than a decade. Paramount had purchased the rights to the La Fouchardière novel in the early sound era, hoping that Ernst Lubitsch, whose ironic, sophisticated technique with sexual material was unmatched in Hollywood, could navigate a path through the production code's requirements. The code broke him. No version of a story in which a pimp lives, a prostitute is murdered by her client, and the murderer escapes legal punishment while his victim's death is treated as structurally logical could be made to end with the gesture of a happy ending the code required. Lubitsch abandoned the project. When Lang acquired the rights through Diana Productions in 1944, the creative conditions had not changed. The code was still in force, prostitution was still explicitly forbidden as a subject, and unpunished crime was still the code's deepest anxiety. What had changed was the audience. A population that had spent 4 years processing the moral catastrophe of the Second World War was considerably less invested in the proposition that the universe was managed by a just administrator. Lang intuited that the window had opened. He stepped through it before anyone could close it again. This is exactly why Dudley Nichols' screenplay, which sailed through the Production Code Administration with minimal objection, was, in the precise language of film scholar R. Barton Palmer, designed for scandal. The Production Code Administration's primary anxiety about Scarlet Street was not the murder, it was the impunity. The code's foundational requirement was that crime not pay. A murderer who was seen to profit from his crime without legal punishment represented, in the code's moral framework, an endorsement of homicide. Lang's solution was theological rather than legal, and it was the solution of a man who had been educated as a Catholic and understood exactly how the church's moral architecture worked. When Breen pressed Lang on the question of Cross's unpunished crime, Lang's response, documented in the production correspondence, was precise. Cross is not unpunished. He is condemned to a private hell of guilt and haunting voices from which no legal resolution can release him. The ultimate penalty, Lang argued, is not execution or imprisonment, but damnation, the eternal consciousness of having committed an irreversible act in a universe that will not allow forgiveness. Breen was himself a Catholic. He accepted the argument. What Lang had constructed was a film whose ending was the most harrowing of any Hollywood production of its era, presented to the censor as a moral lesson, and it was both of those things simultaneously. But the real problem was that the three city censor boards that banned the film had not attended the same theological seminar. On January 4th, 1946, the New York State Censor Board banned Scarlet Street entirely, invoking the statute that permitted the censorship of films that were obscene, indecent, immoral, inhuman, or sacrilegious, or whose exhibition would tend to corrupt morals or incite to crime. The ban triggered what contemporary accounts describe as a chain reaction. 1 week later, the Motion Picture Commission for the City of Milwaukee banned the film under a policy the police department had encouraged for stricter regulation of undesirable films. On February 3rd, the city censor of Atlanta, Christina Smith, issued her own ban, characterizing the film as licentious, profane, obscure, and contrary to the good order of the community because of the sordid life it portrayed, the treatment of illicit love, the failure of the characters to receive orthodox punishment, and because the picture would tend to weaken a respect for the law. Universal Pictures and Diana Productions sued the city of Atlanta, claiming the individual censor lacked the authority to ban what the state censor board had tied on in its vote. The legal battle moved through Georgia's courts for months while the film remained in its first run elsewhere. The number of ice pick blows delivered in the murder scene was reduced in different prints depending on which censorship board had jurisdiction. Some prints contained 7 strikes, some 4, some 1. Lang's film was edited differently for different American cities, producing multiple versions of the same murder, calibrated to local tolerances for violence. This is exactly why Scarlet Street's critical reception in 1946 was reviewing several different films depending on where the reviewer was sitting. Edward G. Robinson, who had spent the 1930s as Hollywood's preeminent screen gangster, the compact, explosive presence that Warner Brothers deployed whenever they needed someone to demonstrate what masculine authority looked like when it curdled into violence, described his role as Christopher Cross in his autobiography in terms that have alarmed every admirer of his performance ever since. Robinson wrote simply that he had hastened to finish Scarlet Street. So monotonous was the story and the character he played, and so monotonous was he as an actor in it. The assessment is so contrary to the evidence on screen that it has been treated variously as false modesty, genuine obtuseness, or evidence of the gap between how actors experience their performances and how those performances register for audiences. What Robinson was describing, in his own vocabulary, is the specific quality Lang was deliberately constructing in Cross. A man so thoroughly emptied by institutional servitude, 25 years as a cashier, a decade of marital debasement, that the space where a personality should be has been replaced by a vacancy that desire suddenly fills. The performance Robinson found monotonous is what makes Cross's catastrophic transformation legible. Had Cross been more animated before Kitty, his destruction would read as punishment for hubris. Because he is as subdued as Robinson describes, what destroys him reads as punishment for the crime of having been born human enough to want something. But the real problem was not what Robinson thought of his performance. It was what his director was doing to Joan Bennett in the same room. Robinson recalled, with the particular patience of a man who has decided to be diplomatic, Lang, once spending an hour rearranging the fold in Joan Bennett's negligee so she would cast a certain shadow he wanted. The detail has been absorbed into Lang's biography as evidence of his perfectionism. The monocled Viennese tyrant who ground productions to a halt in pursuit of visual precision. What the detail actually describes is something more specific and more unsettling. Lang, treating Bennett's body as an architectural element in a visual argument he was making about desire, specifically about how desire operates through surfaces, through the geometry of shadow and light across fabric, through the presentation of a woman's body as an object that a man's gaze constructs rather than encounters. Lang was not arranging Bennett's negligee because he cared about the negligee. He was arranging it because the way it fell would determine what Christopher Cross saw when he looked at Kitty, which would determine what the audience understood about why he was destroyed. The hour was not wasted. The shadow was the argument. Bennett herself never resented it. She credited Lang with the career upgrade she enjoyed after his films and identified his precision as the source of her own best screen work. This is exactly why Scarlet Street is simultaneously a film about a man destroyed by a woman and a film about a director destroying his male character with a woman's silhouette. The 13 paintings that appear in Scarlet Street, including the portraits of Kitty that become Christopher Cross's most intimate expressions of desire and are then sold under her name, were not painted by Edward G. Robinson, who plays a man whose entire identity is organized around the act of painting. They were painted by John Decker, a Hollywood artist and socialite who moved in the same circles as W.C. Fields, John Barrymore, and Gene Fowler, and who produced the work for the production. The paintings that Kitty steals, signs, and presents to a Manhattan gallery as her own, the paintings whose artistic success Cross experiences as both his greatest validation and his final humiliation, are themselves the product of a substitution of authorship. The film's central narrative mechanism, the theft and reattribution of creative work, is executed on screen by canvases painted by a man who is not the character painting them, sold as the work of a woman who did not create them, in a film made by a director whose name appears where the characters should. Long was constructing a hall of mirrors in which every act of authorship in the film is, on examination, a forgery. But the real problem was not the paintings. It was the man Renoir had been, and the film he had made, and what Long had done to both of them, and why Renoir was, in the most precise sense, entitled to find it dislikable. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times found the film sluggish and manufactured, the character stock and Robinson's performance monotonous and lacking illumination of an adventurous spirit-seeking air. Bennett, he wrote, was static and colorless, completely lacking the malevolence that should flash in her evil role. Time magazine's review described the plot as cliched and the characters as dim-witted and unethical. What both reviews describe is a film that declined to give them what they expected from a Fritz Lang production featuring Edward G. Robinson and Joan Bennett, which is to say, the kinetic, gaslit suspense of the woman in the window, a film that resolves its darkness with the merciful disclosure that it was all a dream. Crowther and Time reviewed a film that refused to wake its protagonist up and found the refusal unreasonable. The critics who praised Scarlet Street in 1946, and Variety was among them, finding the production and direction ably projecting a sordid tale, understood what the censors and the Times did not, that Long had made a film whose darkness was not a flaw to be excused, but a position to be understood. The film is now in the public domain, which means it has been available in more formats, more territories, and more context than almost any classic noir in the canon. And the audience it has accumulated across 8 decades of unrestricted availability has produced one of the more unambiguous verdicts in film history. It holds a 92% critical approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It appears on virtually every serious canonical list of essential American film noir. The Museum of Modern Art holds it in its permanent collection. The Harvard Film Archive has programmed it repeatedly as a crown jewel of Lang's Hollywood years. Turner Classic Movie host Eddie Muller, who has done more than any other broadcaster to position classic noir before contemporary audiences, has introduced it on Noir Alley as one of the defining achievements of the genre. The Production Code Administration passed it. 3 city censor boards banned it. The New York Times found it sluggish. The cities lifted their bans. The Times reversed its position. The Production Code was dismantled in 1968. Scarlet Street remains. The film that survived its passage through the C. Chambrine office, 3 municipal bans, a lawsuit in Georgia, and a dismissal from the newspaper of record is, in its final form, the most precise demonstration of what it means to be a German expressionist refugee making films inside a moral system built on the proposition that the universe is just. Long did not believe the universe was just. He had attended the Goebbels meeting. He had watched his wife choose the regime over the marriage and stay behind to write films for it. He had arrived in a country that offered him something resembling freedom and discovered that the freedom operated within a code, a production code, a moral code, a social code, designed to prevent exactly the kind of film he was trying to make. What he made anyway, through the precision of shadow and the geometry of a negligee and the theological argument about Catholic damnation and a French story about a pimp that he transformed into something no Frenchman would have recognized, is a film about the impossibility of escape. Christopher Cross escapes legal punishment. He does not escape. Wherever he walks, the voices follow. The city never ends. The street stays scarlet. Here is the question the film hides in its closing frames like a verdict that arrives after the sentence has already been served. If a man commits murder and walks free while the man who merely loved the same woman is executed for the crime, if the law does not know what happened and God, by Lang's theological arrangement, already has his punishment sorted, then what exactly is the justice system for and who does it actually protect? 3 American cities answered that question by banning the film. Their answer tells you everything. If this investigation changed how you see Scarlet Street, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried arguments that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.